It is the 3rd of February, 1959, 2 in the morning. A small airfield outside a town called Mason City in the flat, frozen middle of Iowa. The temperature is 8 degrees below zero, and a thin, hard snow is blowing sideways across the runway lights. A single-engine Beechcraft Bonanza sits on the tarmac with its engine running. The pilot is 21 years old. He has not slept. He has fewer than 100 hours of experience flying at night and in bad weather. And tonight there is bad weather, and it is night. He has not told the people who own the plane any of this. Inside the plane, 3 young men are getting settled. They are between 22 and 28 years old. They are cold. They are tired. They have been on a bus for weeks. And they are climbing into a 4-seat airplane at 2 in the morning in an Iowa blizzard because the bus was unbearable, and because one of them, the one who chartered the plane, needed to get to the next town early enough to do his laundry before the show. His name was Charles Hardin Holly. The world called him Buddy Holly. He was 22 years old. He had been famous for less than 3 years. He had already changed the way popular music was made, played, and thought about in ways that would not become fully clear until the people who heard him as teenagers grew old enough to explain what he had done to them. He was, by any careful measure, one of the most purely gifted musicians this country had ever produced. And he was about to board a plane he did not have to board, for a reason that has been softened and simplified and partly buried for more than 60 years. Tonight, I want to tell you the whole story. Not the clean version, the real one. Because the reason Buddy Holly got on that plane was not just exhaustion. It was not just a broken down bus. There was a fight. There was a conversation in the weeks before the tour that left something unsettled and raw between Buddy and someone he loved. And the decision he made on the 3rd of February, 1959, was shaped, at least in part, by the weight of that unfinished thing. Pour yourself something warm. This is going to take some time. He was born on the 7th of September, 1936, in Lubbock, Texas, the last of 4 children in a family called Holly, spelled with an E, which the music industry would eventually drop by accident and keep by habit. His father, Lawrence Odell Holly, was a man of modest means and steady faith who worked with his hands and raised his children in the same way, with discipline and music. His mother, Ella Drake Holly, played piano and sang in church. In the Holly household, music was not entertainment. It was a form of address, a way of speaking to God and to each other. Lubbock, in the 1940s, was a flat, dry, cotton-growing city on the edge of the Texas Panhandle, swept by wind in every season, baked in the summer, bitten by blue northers in the winter. It was not a place that had much to do with the wider world, and the wider world in those years did not have much to do with it. But the radio came in at night from everywhere. Country music from the honky-tonks of Nashville, rhythm and blues from the black stations broadcasting out of Memphis and New Orleans, Western swing from Fort Worth, and something else, something newer, something that was beginning to come up through the floorboards of the American South and had not yet found a name. Buddy heard all of it, and Buddy kept it. He was not a particularly large child, or a loud one. He was slight, brown-haired, studious behind the thick-framed glasses that his parents got him at the age of 4, after it became clear that without them, the boy could not see his own hand in front of his face. The glasses would become, in time, one of the most recognizable visual signatures in the history of popular music. But in the beginning, they were simply what a small boy in West Texas wore so that the world would come into focus. He picked up the violin at 5, the steel guitar at 7, the acoustic guitar at 11, and almost immediately it was clear that this was the one, that the guitar and the hand had been waiting for each other. He played in church, he played at school, he played with his older brother Larry on the radio program at KDAV in Lubbock when he was 13, a local talent show for teenagers. and the people running the show put him on again and then again because the boy was simply better than the other children, not in an obvious, showy way, but in a quiet, deep way that you could feel in the room. In 1954, something happened that a lot of boys in the American South felt at approximately the same moment. Buddy Holly heard Elvis Presley. Not on a record, in person. He saw Elvis open a show in Lubbock at the Fair Park Coliseum. A 20-year-old kid from Memphis with hair piled up and a guitar and something coming off him in waves that the people in the seats could feel in their chests. Buddy was in the audience. And after the show, Buddy went home and sat in his room and thought about what he had just seen for a long time. What he understood, watching Elvis, was not just that a new thing was happening. He understood that the new thing was made of the same pieces he already had, the country he had grown up with, the rhythm and blues he had listened to on the radio, the gospel timing he had learned in church. Someone had simply put those pieces together differently. Someone had played them at the same time. Buddy Holly decided, sitting in his room in Lubbock in 1954, that he was going to do what Elvis had done, and then do it further. He formed a band. He played dances and fairs and local clubs. He drove out to Clovis, New Mexico, to a recording studio called Norva Jack that a local producer named Norman Petty had built in an old building near the main street. Norman Petty was 30 years old, a piano player, a perfectionist, a man who had built his own echo chamber and his own control board, and who understood the technology of recorded sound the way a watchmaker understands gears. He heard Buddy Holly, and he knew immediately what he had. He told Buddy to come back. They began to work. And here is where you need to understand something about how the music industry worked in the mid-1950s, because it is important for everything that follows. The standard arrangement in those days, when a producer like Norman Petty worked with a young artist, was this. The producer would handle everything. He would book the studio time. He would work the phones with the record labels. He would negotiate the contracts. He would collect the royalty checks. And in exchange, the artist signed over a portion of the publishing rights, sometimes a very large portion, to the producer. The artist would be named on the record and get a small percentage of sales. The producer and the publisher would get most of everything else. This was not unusual. This was simply how it worked. The artist was young and did not know the business. The producer knew the business and made the artist famous. Everyone understood the arrangement, even if, later on, when the money became real money, the understanding became harder. Buddy Holly signed that kind of arrangement with Norman Petty. In June of 1957, Decca Records released a song called That'll Be the Day, credited to the Crickets. The radio picked it up. Then more radio stations picked it up. Then it was everywhere. #1 in the United States, #1 in Britain. The #1 song in America for the late summer of 1957, played on every teenager's radio from Maine to California. Buddy Holly was 20 years old. He was famous. He moved fast after that, the way only the very young can move when everything is working. Peggy Sue in November of 1957. Oh boy, maybe baby, rave on, not fade away. Every day, a song so stripped down and gentle it sounded like it had been made in someone's bedroom, which is essentially what it was. He recorded in Clovis with the Crickets, then increasingly on his own in New York, where he had begun to go without the band and without Norman Petty, booking studio time himself and experimenting with arrangements that no one in rock and roll had tried yet. He used orchestral strings on a rock and roll record. He overdubbed his own voice. He wrote songs in hotel rooms on the road and called Petty from payphones to work out the structure over long-distance lines. All of this time, Norman Petty was handling the money. In the autumn of 1958, Buddy Holly fell in love. Her name was Maria Elena Santiago. She was 22 years old, born in Puerto Rico, living in New York, and working as a receptionist at the Pure Southern Music Publishing Company on Broadway, where Buddy had gone one afternoon on music business. He walked in, he saw her, And by every account that exists, including her own given 50 years later, he did not hesitate. He asked her to lunch that same afternoon. He proposed to her on their first date. She said yes. They were married on the 18th of August, 1958, 6 weeks after they met. Maria Elena has spoken about those 6 weeks many times over the years. She has said they were the most alive she had ever felt. Buddy was, she has said in interview after interview, not the person the photographs suggest. He was tender. He was thoughtful. He was a man who said what he felt and who listened when you spoke to him. He read. He was interested in everything. He wanted, she has said, to be many things at once. A musician, yes, but also a serious businessman. He wanted to own his own music. He wanted to understand how the industry worked so that no one could ever take what he had built without him knowing it. That desire brought him, in the autumn of 1958, into direct conflict with Norman Petty. The conflict had been building for some time. The royalty checks that Petty was controlling were not being fully and promptly passed along. Some of the publishing rights that Buddy believed he owned had been registered in ways that gave Petty a larger share than Buddy remembered agreeing to. The exact accounting was complicated, as these things always are, and Norman Petty was a meticulous man who kept careful records and who had a version of events that differed in certain key particulars from Buddy's version. By October of 1958, Buddy Holly and his wife were living in a Greenwich Village apartment in New York, and Buddy was no longer speaking to Norman Petty in the easy way they had spoken before. He had hired a New York lawyer. He had begun to try to understand exactly how much money had passed through Petty's hands and exactly how much of it had found its way back to him. The numbers, when they began to emerge from the accounting, were not comfortable. The Crickets, Buddy's bandmates, were closer to Petty. They had grown up with Petty. They trusted him. And they were not entirely sure that Buddy's new wife, this woman from New York, who had shown up and changed everything, was giving Buddy sound advice. There were arguments. The band split. By the end of 1958, the Crickets were no longer touring with Buddy Holly. He was going to go out on his own, under his own name, with new musicians. He needed money. The money that should have been his was still tied up in the dispute with Petty. Maria Elena was pregnant with their first child. The rent on the Greenwich Village apartment was due. And in early January of 1959, Buddy Holly agreed to headline a touring package called the Winter Dance Party, a 24-date bus tour through the Midwest in the middle of February, the coldest month of the year. He agreed to it because he needed the cash in hand, and because he and Maria Elena had argued. This is the part of the story that has been smoothed over for decades, partly out of respect for Maria Elena, who is a private person who has never sought to be part of the mythology of this event, and partly because the people closest to Buddy in those last weeks were not inclined to examine too closely the private dynamics of his marriage. But the accounts that exist, gathered carefully by the best biographers of his life, including Ellis Amburn in his 1995 biography, suggest that the weeks before the tour were not peaceful ones in the Holly apartment. Maria Elena did not want him to go. She was in the first months of pregnancy. She was in a new country, in a cold city, in a small apartment, and the man she had married 6 months before was proposing to climb onto a bus and drive through Iowa and Wisconsin and South Dakota in January and February. She was afraid. She told him she was afraid. And Buddy went anyway. There are things we know about why men make decisions like this, and most of them are ordinary. He had signed a contract. He needed the money. He was a performer, and performers perform. But there is something underneath the ordinary explanation. Something that the people who knew him have hinted at and then stepped back from, which is this. Buddy Holly was a 22-year-old man from Lubbock, Texas, who had been told his whole life by the people around him that he knew what he was doing. And now the woman he loved was telling him that he did not know what he was doing. And the money that should have proved he knew what he was doing was stuck in a dispute with a man back in New Mexico who was not returning his calls. And the band he had built from nothing was gone. And the baby was coming. He needed the tour to be simple. He needed the music to be simple. He needed to stand on a stage in front of people who would scream when he played and feel for 3 weeks like he knew exactly who he was. He packed his bags and he went. The winter dance party began on the 23rd of January 1959. The bus they were given was old. The heating system broke within the first few days and was never properly fixed. The musicians wore their stage clothes to stay warm. Buddy's drummer, Carl Bunch, was hospitalized with frostbite after a night when the temperature inside the bus dropped below freezing. The distances between the venues were enormous, hours and hours of dark highway, through states that had nothing between the small towns except fields and more fields, and the wind coming down from Canada with nothing in its way for 1,000 miles. On the 2nd of February, after a show at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, Buddy Holly decided he had had enough of the bus. He contacted a local charter company and arranged for a small plane to fly him and 2 other performers, Richie Valens and J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, to Fargo, North Dakota, the next stop on the tour. The fare was $36 per person. The pilot was a 21-year-old named Roger Peterson, who worked for the charter company and who had been told the job was his. There are things that Roger Peterson should not have been flying that night. He was not rated for instrument flight, which means legally and technically he was not qualified to fly, using only the instruments in the cockpit when visibility outside the window was 0. The weather that night was not good. The weather that night was, in the assessment of the National Transportation Safety Board, which investigated the accident in detail, genuinely dangerous. The plane took off at 1 in the morning, it climbed into the dark and the snow, and then it stopped climbing. The wreckage was found the next morning in a cornfield 5 miles from the Mason City Airport. The investigators determined that the pilot had become disoriented in the darkness and the weather and had flown the aircraft into the ground, believing in the final seconds that he was climbing when he was in fact descending. The impact was at high speed. No one on board survived. Buddy Holly was 22 years old. It is not comfortable to hold what happened next, which is the collision between the private and the public. Maria Elena Holly, 22 years old and 3 months pregnant, was told that her husband was dead. She lost the baby days later, a loss she attributed to the shock, though she has never spoken extensively about it in public, and we should not push further into that grief than she has chosen to take us. Norman Petty arrived in Lubbock for the funeral. The dispute over the money did not stop because Buddy was dead. In fact, in certain respects, it became more complicated. The publishing rights, the royalty structures, the questions about what Buddy had signed, and what he had meant to sign. These things continued through legal proceedings for years, and the resolution, when it came, was not everything Maria Elena had hoped for. The Crickets went on without him. They continued recording and performing and did their best to carry something of what they had built together into the years ahead. Joe Malden and Nikki Sullivan and Jerry Allison, men who had played music with Buddy since they were teenagers in Lubbock, went on and built good lives and spoke well of him and kept the faith as much as anyone can keep the faith of a person who left at 22. The musicians who heard him and were changed by him were, for the most part, not yet famous themselves. In Liverpool, England, in 1958 and 1959, a skiffle group called the Quarrymen was listening to Buddy Holly records with an intensity that bordered on study. John Lennon and Paul McCartney both later said that Buddy Holly was the first musician they had ever heard who wrote his own songs, played his own guitar, and led his own band all at the same time. When they chose a name for the group that would become the Beatles, they chose a name that played on the word Crickets, a band named after bugs, in honor of a band named after bugs. The line from Buddy Holly to the Beatles is not a metaphor. It is a direct transmission. Keith Richards has talked about hearing Buddy Holly the same way. Bob Dylan has talked about it. Don McLean wrote a song about the day the music died that has been played at every high school dance and wedding reception in America for 50 years. And the day the music died in that song is the 3rd of February, 1959. But I want to be careful here because the phrase "the music died" is romantic, and it is also not quite accurate. The music did not die. It went somewhere. It went into the people who had heard it, and they carried it, and they made it into other music, and that music went into other people and so on, in a chain that has not broken. You can hear Buddy Holly in virtually every guitar-based band that came after him. Not as an imitation, but as a foundation, a way of organizing the relationship between the voice and the guitar and the beat that he essentially invented. And that became the template for everything that followed. What died on that cornfield in Iowa was a person, a specific, unrepeatable human being who was 22 years old and who had argued with his wife before he left and who had not resolved the argument and who had money problems he had not solved, and who was going to Fargo, North Dakota in February on a chartered plane because he needed clean clothes, and because the bus was cold, and because sometimes you make a decision at 1 a.m. that you cannot take back. That is what died, not the music, the man. Maria Elena Holly has lived a long life. She remarried in 1961 and raised a family and has been, by all accounts, a woman of great dignity and considerable private grief. She has spoken about Buddy selectively and carefully over the decades, and the things she has chosen to say have been worth hearing. She has said that she believed in him completely. She has said that the dispute with Norman Petty would have been resolved. She has said that what was unfinished between them when he left on the tour would also have been resolved, because that is what she believed about the two of them, that they were people who resolved things. She has said that he called her from the tour, that they spoke, that he told her he loved her, and that he would be home soon. He was not home soon. There is a version of this story that is told in the memorials and the anniversaries and the television specials, and that version has its truth. The Gifted Boy from Lubbock, the songs that changed everything, the plane that went down in the dark, the musicians who wept, the music that endured. That version is true. But it leaves out the fight. It leaves out the money dispute with Petty that was the reason Buddy needed the tour in the first place. It leaves out the pregnancy and the apartment and the argument that Maria Elena has been too dignified to make the centerpiece of her public grief. It leaves out the fact that Roger Peterson should not have been flying that night, and that if anyone had asked the right questions of the charter company, they might have found a different pilot or waited for different weather or decided that the bus, for all its miseries, was safer than the sky. History tends to smooth the friction out of its great losses. It presents us with a young man and a gift and a tragedy, and it asks us to grieve the gift. That is a reasonable thing to ask, but the whole truth is that Buddy Holly boarded that plane in the middle of the night in an Iowa blizzard because his money was tied up in a legal dispute with his producer, because his band had split, because he needed the cash from the tour, and because there was something unresolved at home that he was perhaps, as young men sometimes do, running slightly toward and slightly away from at the same time. The truth is that he was a 22-year-old human being making the kinds of decisions that 22-year-old human beings make when they are tired and cold and proud and a little bit lost. The truth is that Roger Peterson should not have been flying, and the charter company should not have sent him up, and nobody stopped either of those things from happening. And the truth is that a woman in New York woke up the next morning to a phone call and lost a husband, and then a baby in the span of a few days, and has carried all of that privately for 65 years, and has done so with more grace than most of us would be capable of. We talk about the music because it is easier than talking about that, but I think Buddy Holly would want us to talk about both. He was, by every account, an honest man. He did not like things to be soft when the truth was hard. He said what he meant in his songs, which is why the song still means something, and he said what he meant to the people he loved, which is why the people who loved him still miss the specific person and not just the music. There is a recording made in October of 1958, just before the trouble with Petty became open conflict and just before the Crickets went their separate way. Buddy recorded it alone in his apartment in New York, just a guitar and his voice, a song called Crying, Waiting, Hoping. He made it late at night by himself, and the sound of it is almost unbearably intimate. It sounds like a man singing to one person in a small room. It sounds like something he could not quite say out loud but could say if he put a melody under it. That is what he left us. Not just the hits, not just the innovation, but that quality of honesty, that willingness to say the real thing in the only way he could figure out how to say it. He made that recording 4 months before he died. He was 22 years old. He was in his first year of marriage. He was in the middle of a dispute about money that had not yet been resolved. He was about to lose his band. He was, by his wife's later account, happy in a complicated way, which is perhaps the most accurate description of how any of us are at 22, when we are doing what we love but have not yet worked out the cost of it. The plane went down at 1:17 in the morning. The cornfield was covered in snow, and it was dark, and the temperature was far below zero, and there was no one there to see it except the wind. By the time the wreckage was found, in the cold early light of the 4th of February 1959, the world was already changing into what it would become without him. Which is to say, the world was becoming the world we live in now, the one that has the Beatles in it, and the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan, and everything that came after everything that came after him. The one that has his songs in it, which will still be in the world long after everyone who remembers hearing them for the first time is gone. He was 22 years old. He had a wife who loved him, and a baby coming, and a dispute that would have been resolved, and a life that would have been, if even half the evidence suggests it correctly, remarkable. He boarded a plane in the dark because he was tired and because he needed clean clothes, and because the bus was cold, and because there was something unresolved at home. And he was 22 years old, and 22-year-olds sometimes board planes in the dark. Sleep well, my friend, wherever you are listening from tonight, in whatever city, in whatever small room, in whatever quiet hour. His name was Charles Hardin Holly. He was born in Lubbock, Texas, on the 7th of September, 1936. He was 22 years old. He was one of the finest musicians this country ever made, and the music he left behind is, still today, as alive as the night he first played it. That'll be the day. But I want to go back. I want to go back to the music itself, because we have spent time on the circumstances of his death and the people around him, and that is right and necessary. But it would not be honest to tell you this story without stopping to explain what it was that he actually did, musically, that made everything that followed possible. Because when people say that Buddy Holly changed music, they usually say it and then move on, as if the changing were obvious and needed no further description. It is not obvious. And it deserves more than a sentence. In 1956, when Buddy Holly first walked into Norman Petty's studio in Clovis, the sound of popular music was organized around a clear set of assumptions. The singer sang, the musicians played. The producer controlled the studio. The record label decided what was commercial and what was not. The songs were written by professional songwriters in New York and Los Angeles, who delivered them to the artists the way a tailor delivers a suit. The artist wore the suit, and everyone understood that the suit did not belong to the artist. Buddy Holly did not accept this arrangement. Not out of arrogance, but out of a kind of instinctive and deeply practical understanding that the thing inside him that made the music was his, and that if he gave it to someone else to carry, something essential would be lost in the transfer. He wrote his own songs. Every one of the songs that made him famous came from his own pen, sometimes alone, sometimes in collaboration with the Crickets, but always from inside the thing he actually felt rather than from outside. "That'll Be the Day" came from a line in a John Wayne movie that Buddy had seen with a friend and had been turning over in his mind for months, hearing it as a lyric before he knew it was a lyric. Peggy Sue was named after the girlfriend of his drummer, Nikki Sullivan, but the feeling in it was Buddy's feeling. The urgency and the sweetness of being 20 years old and in love with being 20 years old. Every Day was a song about contentment, which almost no one in rock and roll was writing about because contentment was not considered dangerous enough, not electric enough, not teenage enough. Buddy wrote it anyway, and it turned out that contentment, when it is this honest, is more powerful than almost anything else. He played his own guitar. This sounds ordinary now because almost everyone in popular music plays their own instrument. In 1956, it was not ordinary. The session musicians who played on records in Nashville and New York were professionals. They were excellent. They could play in any style and any key at very short notice, and they did not make mistakes. What they could not do was play the way Buddy Holly played, which was with his own hands and his own hesitations and his own very specific rhythm that was slightly different from any other rhythm in the world because it was his. You can hear it on every recording he made. That particular way of landing on the beat that is not quite where you expect it to land. It is not sloppy. It is precise. It is a precision that sounds like breathing, like the music is inhaling and exhaling rather than simply moving through time. He understood the recording studio as an instrument in itself. Norman Petty's studio in Clovis had a spring reverb unit, and Buddy loved what it did to a vocal. The way it made the voice seem to come from a larger room than the one you were actually in. He experimented with the overdub, recording his own voice twice on the same track so that the two versions of himself would sing together, slightly apart, creating a warmth and a fullness that sounded like a choir of two. He was interested in the technology of sound in the way that a craftsman is interested in the tools of the trade, not as a distraction from the music, but as an extension of it. And he insisted on owning what he made. This is perhaps the most radical thing he did, and also the one that cost him the most, because the people who had helped him make it did not agree with his assessment of who owned it. The dispute with Norman Petty, looked at carefully and honestly, was not a simple story of an artist being robbed by a dishonest producer. Norman Petty was not a dishonest man, by most accounts. He was a man of his time, operating according to the norms of his industry, and the norms of his industry in 1957 and 1958 gave the producer enormous control over the money. Petty had taken Buddy Holly from a teenager playing local dances in Lubbock to a #1 artist in the United States and the United Kingdom. He had done that with real skill and real effort, and he believed sincerely that his stake in what they had built together was fair. Buddy Holly had come to believe otherwise. The disagreement was not just about the royalty percentages, though it was partly about that. It was about the deeper question of who the music belonged to. Petty felt, in a way that was entirely conventional for 1958, that the music belonged to the team that had made it possible, and that he was a large part of that team. Buddy felt, in a way that would not become common understanding in the music industry for another decade, that the music belonged to the person who had made the music, and that the team was in service of that person rather than the other way around. They were both right in the way that people who are arguing about first principles are often both right. And that is the most intractable kind of argument there is. What is not in dispute is that by October of 1958, Buddy Holly was unable to access the money that was sitting in the accounts that Petty controlled. He was, at the moment of his greatest fame, personally short of cash. He had a pregnant wife in a Greenwich Village apartment, a lawyer's bill, and the Crickets gone their separate way. The tour, the winter dance party, was the solution his manager proposed, and Buddy accepted it because it would put cash in his hand immediately, and because he was not the kind of man who could sit in an apartment and wait for lawyers to solve his problems for him. He was a performer. He performed. The winter dance party began, and it was, by the accounts of everyone who was on it, a peculiar kind of misery interrupted by the nightly miracle of the music. The bus was ancient and cold. The venues were high school gymnasiums and small ballrooms in towns so far apart that the drive between them was longer than the show itself. Waylon Jennings, who was 21 years old and playing bass in Buddy's new road band, has spoken many times about what those weeks were like. The cold, the boredom, the darkness outside the windows of the bus at 3 in the morning. And then the moment Buddy walked on stage and everything changed. Waylon has described it as a kind of electricity that was not a metaphor. He said Buddy Holly on a stage was different from Buddy Holly off it, not because Buddy was performing a version of himself, but because the stage was where Buddy was most completely himself. The shyness that he sometimes had in conversation was gone. The worry about the money and the lawyers and the dispute with Petty, gone. The heaviness of whatever was unresolved at home, gone. There was just the guitar and the voice and the people in the gymnasium leaning forward in their folding chairs to get closer to whatever it was that was happening. That is what the people who were there remember. Not the bus, not the cold, the music. On the night of the 2nd of February, the band played the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, and the show was, by all the surviving accounts, a very good one. The Surf Ballroom was a proper ballroom, bigger and warmer than some of the places they had played, with a real dance floor and a crowd that wanted to move. Buddy Holly played a set that included every song the audience had come to hear and a few they had not expected. Waylon Jennings played bass. Tommy Allsup played guitar. Carl Bunch had been hospitalized, and a young local drummer played in his place. After the show, Buddy told Waylon and Tommy that he was chartering a plane to Fargo. He offered them the 2 extra seats. Waylon said he would rather ride the bus. Tommy Allsup lost a coin flip to Richie Valens, who took his seat. Waylon Jennings has said that Buddy, hearing that Waylon was going to stay with the bus, said to him, joking, "I hope your old bus freezes up." And Waylon, joking back, said, "I hope your old plane crashes." Waylon Jennings spent the rest of his life with the weight of that sentence. He has talked about it many times. He has been honest about it in a way that must have cost him considerably, because it is a terrible thing to carry, to have said a careless thing to someone you loved as a joke, and to have the careless thing come true before morning. Waylon was not responsible for what happened. No one who understands the facts would say that he was. But he carried it anyway. The way people carry the last words they said to someone. Because the last words are the last words, and they do not stop being the last words, no matter how much you wish they were different. The plane taxied out at approximately 1 in the morning. It lifted off and turned northwest toward Fargo and climbed into the dark and the snow and was gone from the sight of the people on the ground within seconds. Roger Peterson, the pilot, was a careful young man in most respects. He had been flying since he was a teenager. He knew the Beechcraft Bonanza well. What he did not know, not adequately, was how to keep an airplane level and climbing when he could not see anything outside the window. The specific thing that killed everyone on that airplane is called spatial disorientation, which is the condition that occurs when a pilot's body gives him information that disagrees with what his instruments are telling him. The inner ear, which is what tells you whether you are going up or down or sideways when you cannot see, is an unreliable instrument in the dark. It can be fooled. Roger Peterson's inner ear was fooled. His instruments were telling him the truth, but his body was telling him something else. And in the seconds when it mattered most, he believed his body. The aircraft struck the ground at high speed, inverted approximately 5.5 miles northwest of the Mason City Airport. The impact was not survivable. In the morning, the 4 bodies were found in the cold field. Buddy Holly's body was found some distance from the wreckage, thrown clear by the impact. His glasses were found in the field the following spring, after the snow melted 100 yards away. The glasses are now in the Buddy Holly Center in Lubbock, Texas, which is a museum built in a part of the old railroad depot district of the city where Buddy grew up. The museum has his first guitar. It has photographs of the house he grew up in, and the church where his family worshiped, and the high school, where he did not distinguish himself as a student, but where the music teacher noticed something and kept him after class one afternoon to tell him. The museum has the telegram that was sent to his family on the 4th of February 1959. His parents, Lawrence and Ella Hawley, lived long lives. His father died in 1985. His mother died in 1998. In the decades after Buddy's death, they were, by the accounts of the people who knew them, quiet about their grief in the way that people of their generation and faith tended to be quiet about things that could not be changed. They went to church. They visited with the neighbors. They watched Buddy's music become more famous year after year, which is a strange thing to watch happen to someone you loved when he was a small boy sitting on your lap. They said, when asked, that they were proud. They did not say, at least not in public, what they must have also felt. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is the thing I have been building toward since the beginning. In 1975, a music journalist named John Goldrosen published a careful and thorough biography of Buddy Holly that was the first serious attempt to put the full story on paper. Goldrosen had access to the people who had been there, the Crickets, the people who had worked with Petty, the musicians from the tour, the people of Lubbock who had known Buddy when he was still just a boy from the neighborhood. The picture that emerged from that research was of a young man in transition, a young man who was in the middle of becoming whatever he was going to become next, and who did not quite know yet what that was. The music had taken him as far as the music could take him at 22. The business dispute had shown him that being good was not the same as being protected, and that the industry he was part of would take from him exactly as much as he allowed it to take. The marriage had shown him what he wanted the rest of his life to feel like, and the rest of his life had not yet organized itself around that feeling. He was, in the winter of 1958 and 1959, a man at the beginning of the most interesting part of his story, and the most interesting part of his story never happened. This is the loss, not just the songs he did not write, though there are people who have spent their whole careers thinking about what those songs might have sounded like. Not just the influence he did not have, though the music of the 1960s and 1970s would have been shaped differently if the person who invented the template had lived long enough to see what others built on it and to build further himself. The loss is the man he did not get to become, the father, the businessman who understood what he owned and insisted on it, the older musician who would have watched the Beatles and felt, perhaps, a complicated pride at what they had done with what he had given them. He did not get to become those things. He was 22 years old in a cornfield in Iowa in February, and the snow covered him, and in the morning, he was gone. The songs are not gone. That'll Be the Day is still playing somewhere right now. Not on a radio, perhaps, the way it played in 1957, but on a phone in someone's car, on a speaker in a kitchen, on the earbuds of a teenager in some city who has never heard of Clear Lake, Iowa, and does not know what a Beechcraft Bonanza is, and could not tell you who Norman Petty was, but who is feeling right now in the way that only music can make you feel a thing. Exactly what Buddy Holly felt when he played it. That is the persistence of honest work. That is what happens when a person makes something true. His name was Charles Hardin Holly. The world called him Buddy. He was born on the 7th of September 1936 in Lubbock, Texas. He left a wife and an unborn child, and a dispute that was not settled, and a conversation that was not finished, and more music than he had time to make. He was 22 years old. Take care of yourself. And the next time you hear that voice on a speaker somewhere, and the high hiccuping rhythm of that guitar, stop for just a moment. He is in there. The whole person. The fight he had not finished. The baby he never met. The songs he still had in him when the plane went down. He is in there, and he is telling you something true. Good night.